Hi, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. I have to say it's my first time presenting my work at the Department of Mathematics, so a lot of excitement. But it's also the first time that I'm doing some research on women in mathematics, so I guess one goes together. So my interest in starting looking at the process of becoming a woman mathematician started on one evening some 2 years ago, I guess, where somebody mentioned Sofia Kovalevskaya, and I didn't know her. And I started Googling her, and then I realized how many more women are out there in mathematics that I don't know. And in the beginning I thought, oh, it's my own ignorance, but when speaking with friends who are even in mathematics, I found out that that's an ignorance that is shared amongst mathematicians as well. So this lovely book, Women of Mathematics, was my first entry to the field. It was published in 1987 by the Association of Women in Mathematics, which is American, US based. And it's an excellent book because there are some 40 plus entries on women in the history of mathematics. And most of these entries have actually been written by women mathematicians. So it's a reflection by women in the field, on the field, and that makes it very valuable. And I do remember vividly how I laughed and cried out loudly when in the first page of the introduction I read this. By the 1920s, women in the United States could gain admission to the graduate schools of all the universities with outstanding research departments in mathematics, except Princeton University, which did not admit women to its graduate program in mathematics until the late 1960s. Although women could gain admission, they did not necessarily feel welcomed into the department as bona fide graduate students. For example, are you sitting well? At Harvard University, some professors refused to allow women to sit in their classrooms. They were, however, allowed to sit in chairs placed just outside the classroom doors so that they could hear the lecturer. Okay, so this gives us some idea of the state of the art in mathematics. And we don't talk about the Renaissance, we talk about the late 1960s, okay? So you can imagine how excited I was. You can take this book around for people if they want to see it, because it's an excellent book. So I was so excited, and that's how I decided to start this project on writing a genealogy of women in mathematics. And let me clear some grounds here about what I mean with genealogies and women mathematicians. First of all, when we hear the notion of genealogy, we immediately think of family genealogies and this kind of thing. But genealogies in my research is taken from the philosophy of Nietzsche, who was first who wrote a genealogy of how we came with these notions of good and evil. And then it was taken up by French philosopher Michel Foucault, who was the first to write a genealogy of madness, a genealogy of prison and discipline, and then a genealogy of sexuality. So genealogy, put very simple, is a history of the present. It asks a question that is relevant to the present. What is our present today? And in our case, what is the present of women in mathematics today? But by raising this question, genealogy behaves like Janus. It turns into the past. If we are to think about the present of women in mathematics, we need to understand its history. How have we come to understand and perceive women in mathematics the way we do today? And this book and Harvard and Princeton are just two gems from this history. But genealogy also looks into the future and also asks the question, how can women mathematicians become other? And I guess that's why we are here today, right? That's why you have this seminar series, because you want to problematize the present, understand how this present was constituted the way it is today, but also raising questions about how it can change. And the second important notion is the notion of a woman mathematician. And I insist on this, a woman mathematician, because a woman mathematician is not an object or an entity with two properties. A woman is not an adjective for a mathematician, nor a mathematician can be an adjective for a woman. My argument is that when these two properties come together, they create an explosive entanglement. And the woman interferes radically into what it means to be a mathematician, but also mathematical minds intervene into what it means to be a woman. So this woman mathematician has raised a lot of debates. If you just Google, you will see that the most radical networks in Europe and the US use this notion, in a way criticizing the other notion of a female mathematician, as if it is a mathematician can be male or female, and it's a matter of adjective. And also my argument is that this entanglement of the woman mathematician very much draws on Paul Halmos, who wrote this beautiful book, I Want to Be a Mathematician, and Automathography, and he wrote about the process for him becoming a mathematician. And my argument is that this becoming that Halmos initiated can be very much changed and interfered when the subject of the automathography is not a man, but a woman. In this sense, the notion of becoming as a process comes from the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who started his career at Cambridge and wrote mathematical principles with Russell, but at the end of his career he went to Harvard and he became a philosopher. So this notion of becoming is also very mathematically driven notion, and it means that when you become, there is no something that you end up to. The importance of becoming is in the actual process. Okay, clearing my grounds, that's what we do in cultural theory. And now about the project. There are 6 women in my project, for a starter, and the only criterion of being 6 is that all 6 of them were born and died within the 18th and 19th century. Okay? Very simple. I have been working with historians, and something that I learned from my history lesson is if you are doing history, you have to be precise about your period. Although I have done an initial literature review about all 6 of them, and I have created a blog where you can see them, for the time being I'm working with these 3, Maria Tamboukou, Emily Duchatelet, and Sofia Kovalevskaya. I will refer to these 3 as I go on, but my focus is on Kovalevskaya, because I have found her life story and what happened to her most relevant to this seminar today. And I wanted to do something relevant to contribute to your own process of rethinking gender relations within mathematics. How I work? I work with archives. And there are 2 types of archives: real archives, where you just go and stay there, but also digital archives. where you email the librarian and they send you digitized archives, and I work both with physical or analog archives, as we call them, or digital archives. And there are different cases where I need to go. For the time being, I've only been to France. My difficulty, I know, will be the Russian State Archives and Literature, where they hold everything by Sofia Kovalevskaya. I need Russian mathematicians to help me there, and I have started knocking on their doors, because it's very difficult. I will also need, of course, funding, because this should be an interdisciplinary network, and I will need funding for translations, for interpreters, and all kinds of things. So as I said, this is all very much in the beginning. And while I work with all these diverse real archives, I actually create an archive of my own, because I have found that all these 6 women have a very diverse body of work. Kovalevskaya, for example, she wrote mathematical work, she wrote poetry, she wrote novels. Germain wrote philosophy. Dussolier wrote philosophy, so they were scientists in the old sense of the scientists, where they were writing not just within their discipline, but far beyond their discipline. And apart from their multifarious work that they produced, they have also, other people have written about them. So we have secondary archives. We have a lot, for example, about Kovalevskaya. We have a lot about Châtelet. We have very little about Gaetana Agnesi. We have a lot about Ada Lovelace, of course. Everybody knows her. And we have started having more and more about Somerville. So I call this body the critical archive. And it's very interesting to look into this archive, because there have been so many different interpretations of their lives, of their works, of their everything. And particularly when you work with translations, you can see how in translation many things can be lost, refound, changed, etc., etc. So these are some of the challenges and limitations of the research as it goes on. Now, already, although I'm only working 1.5 years on this project, there are many things arising. There are many, for me, I'm interested very much in the philosophical constitution of the self, so there are many philosophical themes emerging, but for this seminar, I have chosen the themes that I thought would be more relevant to what you're trying to do here, and I have created 2 groups. One group I call associations, and the other I call affects. And as we go on, I will explain more, but, and also, of course, associations and affects are also associated, but what I wanted to say is associations is at the heart of this project. Associations is at the heart of Whitehead's process philosophy, but actually, what associations want to say is that women mathematicians do not simply come out of the blue. They don't pop up like mushrooms. They emerge from very specific historical, social, political, and cultural conditions and networks. And it is only if we understand the complexity of these networks that we can perhaps understand some of the problems that we are facing today. And it is only when we think about this complexity of all these associations that we can start remapping and try to look at how we can intervene in such associations, that becoming a woman mathematician is much more complex than we think. And of course the second group is about affects, and it's about, I call them affects, other people would call them private and personal relations. and it's very simple. Family and personal choices that women have to make, still have to make as we speak. We all make them, and see how gendered these choices are, and in this way how they intervene with the more sort of public, social, historical, political networks. So I'll say more as we go on. The first, one of the things that surprised me a lot when I started looking into the history of associations is what the French call la querelle des femmes, and in English we call it the woman's question, although the woman's question has connotations with 20th century more, so that's why I prefer la querelle des femmes. It's something that everybody knows. So, la querelle des femmes posed the question of what it means to be a woman. Somebody told me 2 days ago, I think, that first time that the Christian church recognized that women had souls was in 300. Up until 300, women didn't have souls. Okay? So once we established that they had souls, then we come in the 15th century, where la querelle des femmes, the question of what women can do, is much more articulated, and we have the famous book of the City of Ladies by Christina de Pizan in 1405, and this Renaissance movement creates the grounds for the first PhD of a woman in science at the University of Padua. I'm so glad I have Italians in the audience here. 1678, Elena Cornaro Piscopia, and she's a scientist. And very close to Piscopia, Laura Bassi gets her PhD in 1732, second PhD in science, and she also becomes the first woman professor with a chair of physics in the University of Bologna. And she's also the first woman elected at the Bologna Academy of Sciences. It's very interesting that women's entry into the Church of Knowledge starts with science, not with literature. Okay, we have to remember that, and I'll come back to it. And this is how, when we think about like a healthy farm and the kind of how they prepare the grounds, we can see how Maria Tamboukou, an Italian bourgeois girl, her father was a merchant, becomes the first accomplished, recognized mathematician. She writes a comprehensive mathematical book that was translated at the time in many languages. And the Pope actually appoints her in 1750 to the University of Padua, chair there, but she never takes up the chair because she's simply not interested. She just loves mathematics, she writes books, and she helps the poor because her life choice is not to get married, not to be social, just to do her mathematics. And her papers are amazing, and I need to go to Milan to read them. Happily for me, they are written in Latin, and I know Latin. They're not in Italian, so I gained some money for translation from there. Now, what is interesting in this environment of what historians call the Catholic Enlightenment is that if we juxtapose it to the real Enlightenment, we have some different paradoxes. Emily de Châtelet, for example, she's a marquise, she's a courtier of the lower aristocracy in France, and she's the first French mathematician, either man or woman, who translated Newton in French. Up until recently, her translation of Newton was actually the main mathematical book they were using in France. Not only does she translate Newton in French, but she also adds her own annotations and comments by bringing in Leibniz ideas into the terrain. So she intervenes in the famous Newton versus Leibniz debate and brings on her own ideas into this. Of course, when I ask people, and that includes me of course, about Du Châtelet, very few people know her, and if they do know her, they only know her as Voltaire's lover, which she was. And she actually lived with Voltaire for more than 15 years. And I'll come back to her relation with Voltaire later on. But what I want to argue here is that Émilie du Châtelet is at the heart of the argument, okay? She's Voltaire's lover. I mean, you couldn't be more at the heart of the Enlightenment than this, could you? And yet, she was never elected at the French Academy of Sciences. She could not even dream of it. The first woman elected in the French Academy of Sciences was something like 1960s, okay? Imagine 1960s at the heart of the Enlightenment in France, and 1746, she's elected at the Science Academy of Bologna. Because Laura Bassi is still there, she teaches her books, and she nominates her together with other mathematicians. So sometimes we know so very little about what they call the Catholic Enlightenment, and we see the paradoxes or the different enlightenments that create these conditions for these women to appear or disappear. And we come now to Sofia Kovalevskaya and to another dimension of associations, which sometimes I call it the cosmopolitanism of science, or citizens of the world, and the importance of international relations. And again, I will compare this to, and we have now been to the 19th century, which is very different from the 18th. In the 18th century, when we have Du Châtelet, women are not allowed to travel, even if they are in the aristocracy. But what they can do, they can invite mathematicians in their chateaus. And that's what Châtelet did, for example. This is a photograph with Algarotti, an Italian mathematician, who had published a book, Newtonismo per le dame, Newton for ladies, which book tells us that there were many ladies interested in Newton at the time. So he had just published this book, and he's at her chateau talking about how Voltaire would call it Newtonizing. Yes, Newtonizing, because Descartes was the prevalent mathematician in France at the time, and the Newtonians were rebels. Okay, so she does this. She's in correspondence with the Bernoulli family. I have read all her letters to the Bernoullis, including the old Bernoulli. She talks to people from the Leibniz school, so there is an international network, but it is maintained through correspondence. With Sophia, however, and we are now in the 19th century, things are different. She was born in Moscow, but grew up in Pallavino, and the dates are very important, 1860s, because 1860s for Russia, I will come back later to it, is the famous 1860s generation. People have been influenced by the Romantic socialist movements in Europe, like Saint-Simonianism and Fourierism, and they are dreaming of a new society. And this dream of a new society includes women. Women have to be educated, and asks men to take a drastic role in it. And that's very important about today as well. The role that men are asked to take in this dream of a new society. And what Sophia then does is that she gets married through a white or fictitious marriage, And that's her only way to leave Russia and go to Europe to study. And that's how she goes to Heidelberg. She spends a year in Heidelberg, finishing her studies because she had already studied mathematics in St. Petersburg. And then her husband, who is also a paleontologist and he's also doing his PhD, takes her to London, where she meets George Eliot, she meets Herbert Spencer, she has a debate with all these big scientists here, and then she goes back to Berlin, where Weierstrass accepts to become her PhD supervisor, but in private. Humboldt University would never accept women in their courses, but Weierstrass is so impressed by what she has done. So what they do is that they have private supervisions twice or 3 times a week. One of these times is at Weierstrass' house, where his 2 unmarried sisters cook dinners for Sofia and Julia Lermontova, another Russian friend of hers, who is the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry. So in 1874, she gets her PhD, not from Berlin, of course, but from Göttingen. And they give her a PhD in absentia, because no woman can stand in front of a committee and defend her a brilliant PhD, which was a brilliant PhD. She needed 1 paper and she had actually submitted 3. So we see then how this network, this international network functions, because it is also through the network that she gets her first position as a docent and then as a professor in Stockholm University by Mittag Leffler, who was one of the founders of the university, but he was also Weierstrass' student. And you see how these networks connect. And we have letters from Leffler saying, oh, I was in St. Petersburg and I met Sofia Kovalevskaya. Oh, she's so beautiful and she's a dame à la monde, he writes. And now I know why Weierstrass thinks that she is his star student. And that's how the connections work, and she gets her first professorial position in Stockholm.
Although she got the position because she was beautiful, or because she was
well, I guess not because she was beautiful, although there were accusations like this. I will show you what the famous August Strindberg said about her position. What I want to, and later on, of course, she submits her paper on the problem of the rotation of solid body around a fixed point, and she gets the Prix Bourdin from the French Academy of Sciences. A year later, she gets a similar prize from the Sweden Academy of Science for the same work. But of course, although she tried hard, she could never get a position either in Paris or in London. It was only in the new University of Stockholm that she could get a position, and her salary was half of the male professors. Her position was fundraised, so there were networks that funded for this position. Her salary was half, and her teaching load was double. Oh. So this may tell us something, okay? Because sometimes we'll, oh, she was the first professor, yes, but with half the salary and double the teaching load. So, but I just wanted you to see how this internationalism, this cosmopolitanism works. And we need to think about it when we think about today. And when we think about Brexit, for example, and what is going to happen. So, I will give you some more examples about encounters. here I have a beautiful manuscript of Sophia's in English. I was able to find manuscript letters of hers in English and in French, but not in Russian, because her papers have not been digitized, so we have to go there and photograph them. But she writes to George Eliot, and George Eliot was the famous woman who introduces her to Herbert Spencer, and they have a debate. Herbert Spencer, of course, he was such a renowned anthropologist, biologist, and also liberal politician, but he was against women's equality. And they have this debate, and you can guess who won. And also, we had a celebration of Sophia's appointment. Here is the London News in August 1884, celebrating her appointment. So it's their front page. On one side there is Sophia, on the other is the new Eton master. We have newspapers in Sweden celebrating her appointment, and we have Olga Strindberg, the famous playwright, writing this well-known, a female professor is a pernicious and unpleasant phenomenon, even one might say a monstrosity. And her invitation to a country where there are so many male mathematicians far superior in learning to her can be explained only by the gallantry of the Swedes towards the female sex. Okay? So sexism at its best from one of the best playwrights of his times, not by anyone. And we also have a nice letter by Sophia writing to Mida Leffler. They are in conversation because Sophia hasn't finished her paper for the Prix Bourdain, and Mida Leffler is putting pressure on her, you have to finish your paper. And she says, yes, but I don't have time because I have to write other things as well because of the salary you are giving me. And then she writes in a very bitter way about Strindberg, and she says, after all, maybe he's right. A woman mathematician may be a monstrosity, may be a monster, but I wouldn't agree with Strindberg that there are male mathematicians that are better than me in Sweden. Okay? So you have this negotiation on a continuous, you have this terrain of fighting. That's what I wanted to show with these letters. Which shows that how important critiques were, how women were affected by these critiques, and how they are still affected by critiques when they have them today. Because women in mathematics are still facing such comments. They are still facing, oh, she got the position because she played the gender card. They are still, I knew a very well-known professor at Berkeley who refused to apply for a position in Cornell because everybody in the mathematical community knew that this position was for a woman. And she told me, I will never apply for this position because I don't want anybody to say that I got it because I am a woman. So we can see this affective importance that is not, when we think about how we can change this terrain in a way that Mida Leffler did, we also need to think about the subtleties, about what I call in the end where our gender sensibility lies. How we challenge this regime not just by quotas, but things that go deeper and actually change the things, not just checking boxes or putting quotas. So, and the role of the institutions are important. I always talked about how the different academies acted and reacted, not just towards Sophia, but towards Claire and Laura Bassi in the past. So institutions and universities are very, very, very powerful institutions in challenging these regimes, these what I call gender regimes. But we need also to know that these institutions can be very contradictory, can be very competitive, and particularly when we think about the state of the British academia today, not just of the British academia, but of the kind of the neoliberal university that we are living in, we can understand how difficult institutional structures are also as well for things to change. So it doesn't only depend on the will of somebody or on the brightness of somebody else. It goes much deeper than this. Another important thing that is also connected to the emerging themes, but also to what I have talked about so far, is the pivotal role of science in the revolutionary imaginaries of the 19th and 20th centuries. And as I said, it all started with Chervinevsky's book, What is to be Done? How do we say it in Russian? So that was such an important book because it started as a novel. It was the book that forced all men to take responsibility about how they would free and liberate women through their sacrifice. And it made such a change. This single book created a whole generation that was more life-changing in science and beyond than even the Russian Revolution. And it's not accidental that, of course, Lenin's famous book, What is to be Done, was taken from Chervinevsky's novel. And Sophia was very much politically involved. She and her sister, Anyuta Jaclar, were involved in the Parisian Commune. Anyuta was also involved in women's education in the Montmartre group of women, and when she came to London as a refugee, a political refugee after the Parisian Commune, she stayed with the Marx family, and she was a very good friend of theirs. So we see here how politics also intervene, very drastically so. Kovalevskaya was thought to be a nihilist girl. When Nina Gleffner tried to find a position for her in Finland in the beginning, the Finnish refused because they said, no, she's an anarchist and we don't want to get in trouble with the Russians because they were part of the Russian empire. So politics are so important as well. And it's not just politics with uppercase, it's politics with the everyday politics, the politics of everyday life. And Kovalevskaya, for example, was very much into these politics. Chagrin was in politics, but for her it was court politics. It was a different kind of politics. But I was so much interested to see how many women of the were involved in the politics of their times, breaking the stereotypes of what we think about women mathematicians, and men as well. And speaking of men, that's, I have already said so much. The role of men is radical in changing the gender regime because women do not live alone in the world. It's not about women, it's about women and men. It's about gender relations. And history has showed us how important all these men were, even from the 18th century. Maupertuis was Chagrin's mathematical teacher, and Voltaire, they were writing essays on the origins of fire together with Voltaire. We talked about Weierstrass. We talked about Meta Gleffler. We talked about the sacrifice that Kovalevskaya's husband did to get married to her and not being able to have any relation with her because that would break his promise, although eventually they fell in love. Even her father, who was a military man, was important because at some point he agreed to pay tutors to give Sophia lessons in mathematics. And these networks between women and men and how important men's role is also went the other way. And we have here young Poincaré, and I have found in the archive some very interesting letters from Sophia to Poincaré this time, advising him. Because she is a professor in Sweden and she's also editor of the Acta Mathematica. Poincaré has obviously submitted a paper and she writes to him, Monsieur, before examining Humbert's article, which you have kindly sent to Mr. Leffler, let me ask if you are aware of Mr. Weierstrass's treatment of the same question. And she very kindly says, you know something, Guy, Weierstrass has solved this problem. Don't bother, okay? And she says it very elegantly, and so it's her turn. And this comes from Poincaré's archive, and we can read it because it's written in French. Sophia was fluent, both in French, English, Swedish, German, and Russian, of course, and I might have forgotten one or two languages. So we see that this network doesn't always go paternalistically, okay? Sometimes it's women's turn to go in and help mathematicians like Henri Poincaré, for example. And I come now to the affect things. I won't say much. I have chosen some letters, some of the last letters that Amélie de Châtelet wrote, because Amélie de Châtelet died at birth. She gave birth to a little girl when she was 41 by her lover, a new lover, not Voltaire, and she knew that she was in danger. And that's a phrase from her last letter where she writes, I am very busy, I need to finish my Newton, send it to the librarian, because then I'm getting ready to give birth and I might die. And we know that that's what she did. One of the last things that she did before she gave birth is to wrap up the Newton book and send it with a letter to the French National Library, because she didn't trust that people would take care of the manuscript after her death. And of course, women and women mathematicians do not die at birth anymore, but maybe their careers die. Maybe we can ask what it is that dies today. And this is something that we need to consider when we think about women mathematicians. And this is another beautiful letter, other kind of affective dilemmas by Sophia to meet Leffler again. Sophia has gone to Stockholm, but she has left her little girl behind with her friend Julia Lermontova. Who, as I said, they were studying together in Berlin. Julia was the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry. She was not just anybody, but she has left her little daughter with her because she doesn't have any other to do so. Her sister has died, her parents have died, and her husband has committed suicide. So she has to leave her daughter behind. And she writes to Leffler saying, I had a letter from Julia and she told me that I have to take my daughter with me. But how can I do that? I'm just going to Stockholm. I need to set up a house for her. I can't just take the child and put her under so much pressure. And if the ladies in Stockholm think I am a bad mother, so be it. I don't care. That's what she writes to him. But it just gives us a glimpse into the kind of affective dilemmas that I'm sure so many women are still facing today when they're trying to have a career in mathematics. So, to come back to the beginning, I have replaced Janus with a three-face statue. And the main face that we are looking at is our present. What is the present of women in mathematics today? Not a very good one, I'm afraid. This graph from the University of Helsinki, Department of Statistics, 2008, just gives you an idea of how they start together, how many men end up becoming the professors and how many women, none. And we talk about Scandinavia here, that's why I chose it. We talk about the countries that created the first modern professor in mathematics in Europe. And the question is, how do we deal with this? And there are so many questions that we need to ask ourselves that include the notion of what I try to explain as gender sensibility. That breaking the regime is not just checking boxes. Some programs, like the Athena Swan program, for example, help, but they are just sliding over the surface. There is so much underneath this surface that has to be done. Women and men have equal responsibility, and maybe men historically have more responsibility than women here, because they have more power positions. They have a responsibility to do something, and what they do should not be mere gallantry, should be much deeper than this. And we also have to think about, as I said, the state of universities today and the state of academia, which is the climate that helps or doesn't help such approaches and experiments. But we need, when we think about the past, we need to think about this beautiful Italian fresco where you have a woman mathematician teaching a boy mathematics. And if that was possible in the Renaissance, why could it not be possible today? Thank you.